I thought we would we would start with something very straightforward and simple. What is a retired or semi-retired journalist's life like for you in Delhi?
Well, it's a good life, it's a very pleasant life. I'm very happy, really, that no longer at any other day or night can you get called out to cover a story or write about some incident which has come on the ticker tape, as we used to call it. I always say that the great thing, really, when I left the BBC was that as the evening came, I could put on a kurta, have a bath, put on a kurta, and open a bottle of beer. So that's one of my practices still. But I still try and keep writing and commenting a bit and keeping my hand in.
It is a coincidence, perhaps, that the founding director of the International Centre Goa was General Sunit Rodrigues, who later became governor of Punjab. And your very first book, which you co-authored with Satish Jacob, is on Amritsar, Mrs. Gandhi's last battle. The question I have is, what role do you think did religion have played in the Punjab crisis or in the events leading to Operation Blue Star or after, which is Mrs. Gandhi's assassination? Was it about religion at all? Did it have something to do with religion, or was it mostly about politics?
Well, it's a mixture of both, I think. And in the book, we said, in introduction to the book, we said this is a warning about involving religion and politics, because there's no doubt about it. And I put this question to Gyanizar Singh when he was president. There's no doubt about it that the Congress party was instrumental in bringing Bhindranwale to the fore. And the reason they did this was basically because Indira Gandhi was very angry with the Akalis. The Akalis were the one political party which really resisted the emergency. And in order to teach them a lesson, she thought she would bring Bhindranwale forward, and Bhindranwale would, if you like to put it like this, be even more of a Sikh than the Akali Dal was. But of course, Bhindranwale got out of control, and then the tragedy gradually unfolded because of that. But of course, there was a strong element of politics in it as well, because the Akalis were making demands which they believed were political demands, which they saw as in their own interests, and the Congress was fighting a political battle with them. But the religious element, I think, really declined, and the political element went up. But it was essentially, in a sense, started as a battle within Sikhism itself.
My last question before Sujay gets his turn. One of your books is titled India, an Unending Journey. And you have been in India since the mid-1960s, as a foreign correspondent, and sometime perhaps in the 90s, you realized that you were going to be an Indian first than anything else. But my question is something different. When we look at writings on India by journalists, and I'm an academic, so academics too, what are the biases that inform the writings of foreign journalists in India? What were the kind of biases you thought were there in the 60s and the 70s? And are foreigners, or even we ourselves, are we perhaps a bit too critical of India's unending journey as a democracy?
Well, I think there was a tendency. When I look right back to 65, 66, that sort of time, India was regarded as a basket case, actually. It was a time, many of you will remember, when people used to talk about India living from ship to mouth, because India was so dependent on PO 480. There was actually a famine in Bihar. There was real reason to believe that the country was going to bankrupt even. There was a forced devaluation in Indira Gandhi's time. And everyone was really writing India off, in fact. And I remember going to a meeting at the BBC in London and trying to persuade people that the peacock, not the vulture, was the national bird of India. And I was doing this because every television team which came to India wanted to film vultures, because vultures were symbols of that poverty and that sort of thing. Well, of course, thank heavens, we've gone way beyond that now. And I wouldn't really like to criticize anyone else's writing. I'm very happy to have you criticize mine. I'm critical of it myself in many ways. But I do think a lot of foreign correspondence and foreign correspondent writing ignores a big sector of the population, and that's the rural sector of the population. And in all my writing, I have tried to include the rural sector in. And I think the rural sector, anyhow, quite apart from being fascinating and hugely important, is it's a very valuable thing to write about the rural sector, because you know the rural sector, you see in the rawest terms the corruption, the incompetence, the nepotism, the bickering within the administration. You see the government at its very worst in the rural areas. And I think people, and that's what I've said this time and again, I think Indians, it's not my job to preach to you, and I not want to preach to you, but I do think that the fundamental problem of India, I've always seen as bad governance. And if you want to see bad governance really in action, you have to go to the rural areas and to the grassroots. And that's why, one of the reasons why I and Chile with me very often have always gone to the grassroots. And I have, in fact, quite recently published a series of stories about the grassroots. And we wrote these stories, we placed these stories in the time of Rajiv Gandhi, because that was a time when, before the economic reforms, before the changes which came, and that was a time when I think the situation in the rural areas.
That's also when P. Sainath started to do his series for the Times of India.
Exactly. And I think Indian journalism in general, and I don't know what you'd say, Sujay, about this, apart from P. Sainath, really does not concentrate nearly enough on the rural areas of India.
Firstly, before I ask my first question, I'd just like to...
would you like to comment on that question?
I will comment.
Very good.
In fact, my series of questions are completely based around that.
Yeah.
But firstly, it's an absolute pleasure, Sir Mark, for you to be with us. And for us, it's an extreme honor. And to celebrate not just your presence here, but your books and your writing and the huge body of work that you've left for us. And I think in your acknowledgements in one of your books, I think No Full Stops, you always said that the journalist should never be the hero, because he walks away from the scene while the real subjects stay behind. But on this occasion, on this evening, we can't help but for you to be our hero, because you're here, and we are very glad that you're here to guide us.
Well, I'm not a hero at all, I assure you.
Well,
I think, could I just say, I think that's a very important point, and I feel very embarrassed, really, having all these things and all that, things happening, because I do very, very strongly believe that as a journalist, a story is the story of the person you are writing about. It's not your story. We journalists so often, don't we? We say,
Sure.
Did you read my story? It's not my story. It's the story of the person
Absolutely.
we write
Absolutely.
about.
Okay, taking off from where you just left off, and since this is also about your books,
Yes.
I'll focus most of my questions based on your books and link it to the India of today. Okay?
Yes.
Now, I've just picked 3 observations that you've made in many of your books. One is the changes taking place in India. You've always said that the changes taking place in India have made an impact in traditional villages of India, but not quite. You spoke about Eastern UP and Bihar, which has been left out of these changes. Another observation that you've made is that the less privileged classes in India are on the move. The caste system is not static, and it's been moving. And the third one that I've picked up is Indian women are not always silent sufferers of male oppression. And you've kind of explained this through your stories. Do you think that all these 3 observations of yours hold true in current India?
Oh, I can't remember all 3.
Okay, let's start with the changes taking place in India, but not taking
Yes.
place enough to penetrate every part of India. Let's start with that.
Yes, well, I think, of course, that is manifestly clear in what was called the Cow Belt, and particularly in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. The changes are not taking place as rapidly as in other places. And I think this brings me back to a point I was making earlier, that why are the changes not taking place? Because the government is, the governance and the operations of the government are so inadequate and so also still pervaded by the old colonial spirit. Your Brock development officer in a place like Bihar or Eastern UP behaves as though he was a colonial official, and when you go to him, you have to, in effect, bow before him and ask help from him. I'll give you an illustration of that. When I was in one village and we were talking about the problem of the poor not getting below poverty cards because of the corruption in many rural areas. Below poverty cards are actually given to people who are well above poverty and not given to those below. And I said to one villager, why do you not then go to the block development officer and say to him, I don't have a BPL card, I demand it. Or go to the Sarpanch. And he said, if I go to the block development officer, he will just turn to me and tell me, bargo, bargo, bargo. Get out, get out, get out. And that, I think, is the main reason. You see, crores, it's not just a question of money. Crores of rupees has been spent on health, on education and all the rest of it, but the systems are not delivering. And one of the reasons is because really they have not been reformed since the British days, many of them, and the ethos of the British day of the rulers being, of the government servants being rulers rather than servants of the public.
But hasn't this new so-called visionary government of today changed all that?
No. No, I think that's one of the problems. I think one of the reasons why the programs that the Prime Minister has announced, especially in the rural areas, have not been far from reaching their completion. You know, when you look at the Swachh Bharat campaign, you can see that Bharat is anything but Swachh. When you hear about the building of lavatories, yes, a lot of lavatories have been built, but the implementation of that project has been very inadequate, and lots of the lavatories don't work. You know, I once went to a small town called Jajja, just outside Haryana, just outside Delhi in Haryana. What did I find there? I found that in order to say that Jajja was open defecation, they had imported 3 or 4, and it's 4 it was I actually saw, mobile toilets, very cumbersome sort of things pulled by tractors with 4 different toilets in them. And all 4 of them were in a state of dilapidation. The tires had been stolen from them, the tanks had been stolen from them, they were filthy inside, the doors were hanging open, and one of them was within about 20, 30 yards of the circuit house, brand new circuit house built by the government. So that is the standard of the implementation of the programs. And I think that this government, the one thing it has not tackled is administrative reform.
Another question that probably kind of leads from this is, see, one of the big hopes, again, taking a leaf from your book, was you had always hoped, and this is, again, a passage from your book, that power would transfer from the elite to the majority, and the people would no longer be just subjects, but partners in progress. How much of that has happened over the past few years?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely true. I think that one of the problems with India is, again, it's a legacy of the Raj, that far too many people expect the government to do everything. And not nearly enough people, especially again in the rural areas, are prepared to get together and do things for themselves. There is a wonderful NGO in Rajasthan called Seva Mandya. And I've been associated with them loosely for some time. And it's a real eye-opener to go with them into the villages where they have a campaign of trying to get the villagers to stand together and demand what they should get from the government and do what they can do for themselves. And you know, when villagers stand together, you see the difference which happens. In Gujarat, where we were once and wrote a chapter in a book, enormous amount of water harvesting work has been done. And the villagers came to their senses, and they realized that when they did the water harvesting, it worked, and it was done properly. When the government did it, it was a shambles, basically. And I remember being taken to one water harvesting dam type thing, which was half built by the government. And you could see what the government was doing. They were saying that this was a concrete dam, but actually you could see that the dam was full. There was a coating of concrete on top of rubble and mud, completely disordered, if I could put it like that. But this would go down in the book as a solid concrete dam. That's an example, whereas the villagers themselves were building and doing excellent water harvesting work.
One more quick question, Robert. Yeah. On a lighter note, don't you think that at a time when you did your journalism and went to the heartland of India, and we as rookie journalists went there, there were a lot of bloody stories, interesting stories, stories of violence, gang wars, people killing each other, blood for blood, the title of one of your books. And one could, freely, report and put it out there and broadcast it. And there was so much fun, for the lack of a better word. But as journalists, we are selfish. We are hungry for stories. Yeah. And a lot of your stories that appear in your books, and I can quote Blood for Blood, Gundas of Gopinagar. The Gundas of Gopinagar is from this book, The Heart of India, and it's all about how different gangs in UP used to corner all the railway contracts. And obviously the politicians were in their pockets. But these are all real stories that we've all seen and reported in UP. In Blood for Blood, it's a very interesting story of how an upper caste man, Thakur, is killed by his Dalit servant. And then the Thakur gang avenges it. My question being is that, do you feel that journalism these days is less pulsating, less exciting, and also people don't go into the heartland of India to get these stories out? Or do you see India itself is changing, and probably it's a quieter and a safer place, so these stories don't exist?
Well, I don't go into the villages and rural areas as much as I used to. I have to admit that. But I don't expect, I think that probably in many ways India is more violent now than it is. Certainly reading about these horrific lynchings which didn't used to take place that I ever came across anyhow. And I think again, part of the reason for these problems is the police, who again are an old-fashioned colonial police force, very often corrupt, very often taking decisions because politicians asked them to take those decisions, telling lies, distorting situations. So I think that the violence does continue, but I also think that we shouldn't overestimate these things. That of course village after village where people are living in perfectly good harmony, and as we all know, Muslims and Hindus in many villages live side by side. Dalits and Thakurs live side by side in many villages in harmony. So we mustn't get the thing out of context. But on the other hand, undoubtedly there is a lot of violence in rural areas.